Garrick's scream split the courtyard like a blade, half human, half wolf, and for a breath, the moon itself seemed to flinch. His mother's blood slicked the flagstones, warm and furious, and Alara's hand clenched at her throat as if she could choke fate back into obedience. The renegade Omega stood over them both, lungs heaving, eyes like flint. And for the first time in his life, Garrick understood what it meant to belong to two things at once: to his mother's iron will and to a wild that answered when everything he had been taught failed. He did not mean to hurt her. He had meant to protect. The transformation came like a confession, fur tearing along his arms, teeth lengthening in a pulse of terror and clarity, and the roar that ripped from him carried a truth his childhood had never allowed. He would not be the shadow of an heir any longer. Wait, before the next revelation unfolds. If this story has already captured your heart, let us know where you're following from. To ensure you don't miss unexpected twists, emotional reconciliations, or new beginnings, subscribe and stay connected. Now, back to the story. The courtyard smelled of iron and lavender, the signature of Alpha Ilara's compound, a scent meant to soothe and to mark territory, and it stung Garrick's nostrils like accusation. He had lived his 26 years within a radius of stone and rule, schooled in the art of diplomacy and the ledgered cruelties of negotiation. They had taught him to smile like an heir, to deflect questions, to never let a tremor in his voice betray what he felt. Never had they taught him how to fill lungs that suddenly wanted more than air meant for polite conversation. Never had they taught them the animal rent inside him that now stood between his mother and a woman who had come here with a blade and a past full of shattered trusts. Renata Thorne had been the kind of rumor that shivered through the pack before she set a boot on their soil. Renegade, exile, Omega who spoke to humans and called hierarchy a relic. She moved like a wound, purposeful, open, honest in a way Garrick's world scorned. Up close she smelled of smoke and river mud, of a life lived on the margins, and the thin silver scars that laced her forearm made Alara's men bristle. When she had stepped into the courtyard under the thin light, she had looked at the Alpha and then at the sun with an intensity that stripped them both for what they were. "Alpha Ilara," Renata had said, voice low and steady, "you took a promise and sold it to the highest bidder. You left people to burn. I want what you chose not to pay." Ilara's reply had been a blade in velvet. "You come here after years of song and no apology and demand recompense, renegade? You think you can frighten me with ghosts?" It would have been over then, Garrick told himself later, if not for the way the renegade's fingers had closed around Ilara's wrist.
If not for the quick feral move that toppled the Alpha backward, a motion half grace, half bargain. The courtyard had become a clearing, law replaced by urgency. Garrick had run forward because that was what had always been expected, the son of the Alpha intervening on his mother's behalf. And then the world shifted. He had seen himself as smaller than a wolf for 26 years, not broken exactly, but incomplete, the elders whispering that he had a human heart when lycanthropy pulsed through their bloodlines. He had learned to sit with that difference, to tuck it into polite meals and family displays. But when Alara's breath hit a staccato, when the renegade's palm left a crescent bruise, something inside him answered with a hunger that had never belonged to the Garrick who could sign treaties at a table. It was not the legacy they had promised him. It was a force that belonged to neither throne nor contract. His first roar startled the raven that had settled on the high battlements and ripped a line of stone mortar free like a thrown coin. The guards, those stoic figures of leather and oath, halted mid-step to stare at the impossible. The Alpha son standing half man, half beast, eyes that glowed with the moon's confession. For a fragment of eternity, no one moved. Garrick felt the pack's history press against his ribs, generations of Alphas, the ledger of obedience. But over that weight there flowed a current he had never acknowledged: relief. In the brutal clarity of newfound strength, he realized he had always wanted someone to see him as he was, not as a title. He also felt, with a backward lurch, shame. His claws found Ilara's sleeve as if to steady her. They also dug through fabric into flesh when she twisted. The expression on his mother's face was not pain, but destruction. She had never wanted to be seen as fragile. Ilara's eyes did not register surprise. They registered a betrayal that cut deeper than the blade at her ribs. She had made Garrick for a role, not a person. And in the instant he broke that mold, she saw decades of restraint and cruelty etched into her jaw. Renata did not flee. Instead, she lowered the dagger, the tip trembling, and her chest rose with ragged breaths. "I meant to speak," she said, voice softer now. "But you fight like every alpha I've ever met. You choke your bloodlines with promises and debts. You were exiled for consorting with humans," Alara spat, her voice a thin, dangerous thing. "You bring human sympathy here and you ask for justice? You are no kin of mine." "The law does not forgive what the alpha commands," Renata answered. "You sold names across borders to secure your pack. In return, you left those who trusted you without shelter when a rival burned their homes. A promise is not a ledger entry, it is a life." Garrick's wolf nose twitched. He could smell fear in Renata, sharp and close, and beneath it, something like principled fury.
He could smell his mother's centuries of compromise, the perfumes of stability she wore to mask deals made over wine. He could smell his own confusion and the iron tang of blood on his palms. The courtyard, always a statement of control, had turned into a theater of all the things they had never spoken aloud. The elders had gathered along the periphery, silent figures carved from tradition. They waited like a jury. They had the power to call for justice, for exile, for blood, and their silence was louder than any verdict. Garrick's transformation altered their calculus. Here was an heir not merely born to inherit, but to change, and for some of them that change was an abomination, for others a dangerous curiosity. Alara's face folded into a mask of command. "This insolence will not stand. You will explain yourself before the council, Renata Thorne, or you will leave this place in chains." Renata straightened, and something like pity softened her eyes as she looked at Garrick. No, past Garrick, at the part of him that had always been barred. "You don't have to do this for her," she said. "I didn't come here to start a war. I came because my sister, because people like her, needed what you promised and did not receive it." For a moment, Garrick forgot to breathe. He had known of villages left unprotected on the edges of the Pack's territory, whispers that his mother's treaties favored borders and holdings while people perished. He had never connected those ghost stories to the Alpha who sat wounded at his feet. If Renata's accusation held, Alara's hands were not only firm, but stained. "My sister?" Garrick asked, his voice a strange, gravelly thing. "Which?" But Alara's laugh cut him off, sharp and without warmth. "You will not bring ghosts into my court to shame me, son. You will stand down. You will learn what it means to be an heir." He wanted to obey. He wanted to slip back into the narrow garment of duty and never let the wolf within him show its teeth. Instead, his hands, scraped and slick, tightened on his mother's shoulder. The new strength in him resisted the order like a muscle resists a blade. The dilemma unfolded like a wound. He could follow the script written for him, bind Renata to the will of the pack, and restore the balance Alara coveted, thereby securing his future and his mother's legacy. Or he could follow what the wolf in him sensed, an ugly, beautiful inclination towards freedom and towards a woman who had looked at him not with fear, but with something like recognition. The choice was not merely political, it was personal. It would decide what kind of man, what kind of wolf, Garrick would become. In the quiet that spread, Renata's gaze never wavered. "I didn't come to be caged," she said. "I came to be heard. If you stand with your mother, with the ledger, then fight for that. But if you ever thought there might be another life, one that isn't penned in by promises, then listen." Alara's breath hitched. For the first time in Garrick's life, he saw a fissure in his mother's composure, a suspicion that power could not by itself guard against shame. The courtyard felt too small for all the truths that pressed against it. Garrick felt the tilt of his world begin to shift, a scale balancing between loyalty and something like the possibility of being seen whole. As the moon climbed, the elders prepared to call the council. Garrick's people looked at him not as a son, but as the hinge upon which many futures would swing. He had minutes, maybe less, to answer a question that had never been asked of him before. Would he be alpha-made, forged by oath and expectation, or alpha-born, a creature who claimed his own shape? The wolf within him rumbled its impatience, and Renata, watching him with elbows braced on the hilt of her blade, seemed to issue the same silent command. He could surrender Renata to chains and restore order. He could order her exiled anew, let the law play its cold hand, and be the son the pack expected. Or he could do the unthinkable, side with a renegade, side with the accusation against his blood, and risk everything, his position, his mother's ire, the fragile thing that had only just awakened inside him.
That was the last clear thought Garrick had before the elders rose in unison, and the courtyard fell into a hush that felt like the inhale before a storm. He had never felt more alive and more terrified. The dilemma came down on him like winter: protect the blood that had named him, or protect the truth that might free him. He licked his split lips, feeling fur against teeth, and understood that whichever choice he made would not only shape the pack's destiny, but carve the identity he had been starving to claim. The elders' collective breath was a held thing, as if the stones themselves waited to learn which fate Garrick would choose. Murmurs rippled through the gathered. A beta with a scarred cheek whispered that a son who wolfed at 26 was a danger. A grandmotherly elder with milky eyes folded her hands as if in prayer for the boy she had seen grow up but never quite know. The council matron pointed with a jeweled finger toward Garrick as if he were the one on trial, and someone barked for order, but the weight of the moment had already landed. "Garrick Thorne," Elara said, voice reduced to the diamond edge she used in treaties. It was the name she had said 1,000 times at births, marriages, arrests, always the same, always the claim of lineage. "You will answer for this breach. Is this the action of the heir you will have lead us?" Garrick felt the pack's gaze like weather, alternately warm and lethal. He tasted iron, the lingering copper of blood mingling with the salt of the evening. The wolf inside him bared teeth at the command. It was a strange form of courage, the kind that came from finally feeling something that had been dulled for years. He had always imagined his voice would be steady. Instead, it skimmed the edge of a snarl. He pressed his palms to Elara, feeling the tremor under her bone, feeling the life she had poured into the throne weaken into a human vulnerability. "I will answer," he said, more to himself than to the court, "but not by the ledger of your choosing." "What insolence!" Elara snapped. "You will not dictate our justice." She looked at Renata, a blade of cold retribution forming in her stare. "And you, renegade, will you accept exile without further disturbance, or would you like the elders to make an example of you?" Renata's laugh was low and uncomplicated. "Example? I gave up being an example the day they branded me for choosing humanity over ritual." She lifted her chin toward Garrick. "This is not about me. It is about the people your mother bartered away." A ripple of anger met her words. Someone cried that this was slander. Another voice, thin and appraising, asked for evidence. The pack leaned in like a beast smelling a wound. Garrick stepped up to the small raised dais where the elders sat, his fur rough at the shoulders, his breathing measured but elastic. The wolf pressed under his skin like an animal wanting to be named. "Ask," he said. "Ask what you must, but let there be truth in this council, not the kind my mother has learned to sell." Silence thinned until he could hear the hiss of a candle and the faint rustle of a cloak. The matron who had raised Elara's eldest rival, old, wise, and impartial, peered over her spectacles. "Proof, Renata," she said. "When you make such a claim, you must bring what you can to bear." Renata's fingers tightened on the dagger hilt, but she did not look away. "The ledger of payments, names marked in my sister's journal, treaties signed, dates of fires, witness accounts, the homes that were surrendered. I have letters, I have survivors, if you will hear it." An elder barked that written proof could be forged. Human scribes were notorious. Another elder, trusted for his fairness, said simply, "Bring them. We will not send any back into exile without hearing what they claim." Elara's jaw flexed. Garrick could see how she calculated. Delay, bury the accusations, discredit the messenger. The old ways favored smoke and the slow death of reputation, yet the accusation hung heavy. The council could not ignore blood on its hands without earning a stain that would fester. "Very well," Elara said, though her voice was less certain than when she'd been moved in battle. "We will schedule a hearing. You will present your evidence. Until then, you will be detained under watch. You will not leave the compound." Renata's eyes narrowed with gleaming white intent. "Detention?" she echoed. "You will be caged until the truth is determined," Elara said, "for the safety of this pack." A murmur, anger, triumph, relief, ran through the gathered. Some cheered the law. Others, Garrick could see, hung in the balance between curiosity and fear. The guards moved toward Renata, leather cords slipping from their pouches, and the renegade did not run. She allowed them to bind her, her wrists bruising as iron met bone. Yet as they led her away, she turned her head and fixed Garrick with an intensity that felt like an unraveling. "You can free them," she said just for him, "not with a title, with choosing." Her words lodged like a stone. He watched her go, watched the guards close the courtyard gate behind her. Behind the iron, Renata's silhouette halted, as if to look back one more time. Garrick felt suddenly very small and very enormous, both an heir and a hunted creature. After the council dispersed, people circled Garrick with questions that were more accusations than curiosity. A beta who had trained under his mother's orders told him he'd crossed an unseen line. A childhood friend, now grown and hardened, pressed his shoulder and whispered, "You wolfed Garrick. What did it feel like?" "It felt like finding a muscle I didn't know I had," Garrick admitted, and the confession felt intimate on his tongue. He saw his mother retreat to the inner halls, shoulders rigid, eyes avoiding his. There was shame there. There was wrath, too. He could read the map of her disappointment like a fortune teller reading palms. He had not intended to wound her. He had intended to protect. That night, he found little sleep. The compound felt altered, like a bone that had been broken and then mended wrong. The corridors were hushed. Servants moved like shadows. The moon, a vicious, knowing presence, hung outside his window and painted his sheets silver. He rose and padded to the training yard, where the pack's older wolves practiced form and restraint even at odd hours. He needed to feel whether the wolf would always be intrusive or whether it could be learned. A lone figure waited by the weapon racks, Tomas, Garrick's old sparring partner and one of the few people whose loyalty to him was unstinting. "You should have let me come in the courtyard," Tomas said. "What happened out there was not what I expected." Garrick sat on the cold stone, feeling the fur puff along his forearms. "Neither did I." Tomas studied him, then with blunt compassion said, "You're danger to some and salvation to others, Gar. You know that? Your mother's reign, she kept us safe in her way, but not everyone's. The map of her protection left gaps." "It did," Garrick said, "and I just saw one of those gaps with my own eyes." Tomas's hand found Garrick's shoulder, a firm, human hold. "You could have sent Renata away. Exile is what they'd have done. But you didn't. Why?" Garrick closed his eyes and let the moonlight slide across his lids. He remembered Renata's face, the ferocity, the unmasked grief. He remembered the taste of blood and the shock of wolf bones shifting under a body that had always felt wrong in its skin.
"Because, for the first time, the wolf inside me," he stopped, unsure if the truth would sound like betrayal. "Because she looked at me like she saw me, like I was not meant to be a shadow." Tomas's mouth formed a thin line. "Seeing you is dangerous. It might make you want more than the pack can let you have." "Maybe I do want more." The admission trembled out and landed between them like an unused blade. Garrick realized how tired he was of wanting, of being told what to yearn for. In the days that followed, the once brittle order of the compound shifted into a frenetic half-life. Elders consulted with fetched scrolls and human emissaries who could attest to manuscripts. Renata's detention became the center of whispered strategies. If the council found in her favor, it would be a crack in the compound's legacy. If they condemned her, it would be a spectacle of reasserted power. More dangerous to Garrick than the public theater was the private distance his mother maintained. Elara's eyes avoided his in public and in private. Once in the dim kitchen, he found her alone, hands clenched around a cup that left a ring on the table like a wound. He sat down across from her, hands folded, the wolf heavy but controlled. "Elara," he began, the name tasted of childhood dinners and strict bedtime. "You didn't have to brand me with a role." She did not look at him. "You were born into a line that needs steadiness. You were given a future to stabilize our borders, Garrick. That is not branding, that is survival." "Survival at what cost?" he asked, soft but pressing. "At the cost of people's lives on the border? At the cost of those who trusted our treaties?" She finally met him. For a sliver of a second, he saw not the alpha, but a woman with a ledger in her hands and a tired face. "There are things you do not understand," she said, and the old threat hummed in her voice. "Power requires decisions you will never want to make." "Then teach me," he said. "Teach me the things you say you did for the pack. Don't make me wear them because you think I owe you. Show me." Her laugh was small and brittle. "You mistake the world's cruelty for a lesson, son. There are no honest teachings in those choices." He wanted to argue until dawn. Instead, he found himself asking the question that had been burning. "Did you ever consider them human, the ones you signed away?" Her face went hard as flint. The alpha's composure returned like armor. "This conversation ends now." She stood and left, the cup forgotten. The sting of rejection was not new. The alpha's son had been rebuffed his entire life, but the wolf in him throbbed like a newly opened vein. He stepped out into the moonlit garden where foxgloves bowed like mourners and found Renata there, despite her detention.
How she moved so easily between bars and the open air, he did not know. Perhaps some things were invisible to the pack unless you chose to see.
She sat on the stone bench, knees drawn up, blood still drying along her forearm where a cuff had bitten. Her hair had loosened from its braid and fell across her shoulders like a banner of rebellion. She looked at him without flinching, an offer and a challenge braided into her posture. "You shouldn't be here," Garrick said. "I could say the same," she replied. "The guards leave gates open when they are tired." He wanted to ask her a dozen things at once, about her sister, about the fires, about what she'd expected when she had come. But instead, he found himself asking what he perhaps should not. Why risk all of this? Why attack my mother? Her laugh this time was softer, and for once it carried no steel. "I didn't attack to hurt. I attacked because the only time they listen is when something breaks. I thought if I forced the pack to look, we might get help. I misjudged how they would hear, how they would cover it in stone." "And did you expect me?" he asked, surprising himself with the admission. "Did you expect I'd interfere?" "No," she said. "I expected the Alpha to be guarded. I didn't expect the heir to rip his chains and howl." The admission made him want to laugh or cry. I don't know whether to be flattered or furious. "Be both." She tilted her head. "There's a wolf in you that was always there, Garrick. Something old, something made of moon and hunger and the need to protect. You saved my life when you didn't let my words be swallowed. I also hurt my mother." The shame came like a reflex. Renata's eyes softened. "You didn't want to hurt her," she said. "You wanted to be seen." Two things can be true at once: love for someone and the conviction that what they've done is wrong. The truth of that sentence sat between them like a bridge. He realized that the pull he felt toward her was not merely physical. There was something about the way she dismantled his certainties with gentle, dangerous hands. She had been the instrument of his awakening and the mirror in which he saw himself whole. "We have enemies," she said after a beat. "People who will see what happened and decide it is time to move against this pack. If the council sides with your mother, they will make me the scapegoat. If they side with me, they'll call it mutiny." "And what do you want?" Garrick whispered. The moonlight made her eyes into storms. "I want justice for fires that never had an apology." She reached up and touched the scar on her forearm. "I want to stop being exiled for choosing humanity." He thought of the wolf, of the roaring power he'd felt when his body shifted. It had given him a clarity he'd never known. But clarity demanded action, and action demanded consequence. "Then we choose carefully," he said. "We gather proofs, we listen, we protect the people who might be at risk, and he swallowed the rest. "And we decide what kind of pack we want to be."
Renata's gaze narrowed with the faintest smile, danger wrapped in promise. "You're asking for a revolution in small steps, heir." "I'm asking for honesty," he corrected. "And for the first time, I think I want the chance to make a choice that is mine." She stood, and the space between them hummed. "Choices have costs. So do silences," he said. The words landed like a plea. They lingered there in the garden, two people on the cusp of a dangerous intimacy, each aware of how the pack would scrawl their names on lists: traitor, renegade, heir, martyr. The future felt like a carved map with too many lines leading to cliffs. Garrick's chest ached with the knowledge that whatever step he took next would reshape lives. Over the next days, the hearing was scheduled. Witnesses assembled, survivors with blackened hands and boiled-down stories, scribbled pleas carried by Renata's emissaries, letters with signatures that once meant protection. The pack watched with a feverish curiosity, leaning into the spectacle like a wound leaning towards salt. When the day arrived, Garrick stood at the center as if the entire history of his family balanced on his shoulders. His mother took her seat like a queen, noble and implacable. Renata stood on the other side, bound only by the law until proved otherwise. The elders sat between them, embodiments of tradition and the last line before chaos. The proofs were messy and human,
a child's charcoal sketch of a burned home, a letter with a seal from a rival Alpha, a witness who cried as she described the night her father left the compound to the mercy of the border guards and did not return. Each testimony cut like a knife, and each truth gnawed at Garrick's sense of loyalty. At the edge of the council hall, a murmuring formed into a roar as a human emissary, one of the scribes Renata had once befriended, produced a ledger. The pages had been logged to the very moment treaties were signed and payments recorded. Names were circled in ink. The ledger contradicted what Alara had said in years past. In the hushed explosion that followed, Garrick felt the room tilt. Alara's face blanched, but her voice remained steady as a blade. "These are fabrications," she declared, "forgeries meant to sow doubt into a pack." The scribe's hands trembled as he laid more pages down. Garrick's chest felt like a drum. The wolf ran his fingers along his own arms as if to comfort a hurt. In the furious, unsettled quiet, he realized the choice he'd thought he had to make was dissolving into a larger truth. The pack had been built not only on protection, but on compromises that paid for safety with other people suffering. And in the silence between one testimony and the next, Garrick understood that his choice would be not between his mother and Renata alone, but between a life lived to continue the ledger and a life lived to break it. The weight of that pivot spun the world beneath him.
He tasted iron and possibility, and something like fear and exhilaration braided into a single raw sensation. Behind him, he felt Alara stare, hot, relentless, the look of an alpha who had been slighted. Before him, Renata's profile was as calm as a flame. Between them, the council waited for him to speak. He could feel the wolf's impatience in his bones, the animal's urge to mark territory with teeth and instinct. He could also feel the man he had been taught to be, to act with measured speech and diplomatic calculation. Both were true. He had to choose which truth he would make the law of his life. When his name was called, the moment he had feared and desired arrived like a tide. The hall leaned in as if it wanted to hear the future. Garrick drew breath and, in a voice that trembled but held, stepped forward to answer the pack's most dangerous question. He could hear the hush like wind through dead leaves as he stepped forward, the floorboards of the hall suddenly intimate under his boots, the wolf inside him raking claws across a map of old loyalties. The elder's eyes were pinpoints of lamp glow. His mother's face was a school of ice and accusation. Renata stood rigid, the quiet of a woman who had already meant to lose. Garrick's voice, when it came, was not the polished cadence he had been trained to use for treaties. It was raw, pulled from places in him that had only just been named. "I believe them." The words landed with a weight that made someone in the back gasp. Ilara's laugh was quick and cruel. "You believe a renegade over your own blood?" "I believe people who were burned," Garrick said, and felt the wolf in him circle the syllables like prey. "I believe witnesses who sat here and told the truth with tremors in their hands. I believe this ledger is not a forgery because the ink matches other documents we've held. I believe we have been hiding fires behind our borders and calling it strategy." A murmur rose, anger, disbelief, the scent of panic. An elder with a throat like gravel demanded proof that wasn't already on the table. Another, younger and more hungry for change, looked at Garrick with something that might have been hope. Ilara's face collapsed into 1,000 small betrayals. Garrick had never seen that equation of grief and fury on her, and it broke him in a way that made his wolf whimper. "You are making a dangerous choice, son," she said. The words were not only scorn but a plea wrapped in steel. "Turn your back on your commitments and you turn your back on this pack's security. We do not give away borders for sentiment." "This is not sentiment," he snapped, teeth flashing under the moonlight. "This is blood. The ledger shows where promises were traded for lands. Men slept in barns because treaties favored fortresses. That is not strategy. Those are bodies." Ilara's hand lifted then, an old habit, a gesture of command learned in the teeth of battle. You will not silence me," Garrick said, finishing for her. The hall felt suddenly too small for all the truths and all the lies. "You told me the world needed me to be a certain thing so we could survive. I have survived by your rules, but I will not be complicit in a system that prices people's safety against our borders. The room erupted, voices like sudden rain, calls for exile for Renata, for Garrick, for the scribe who had produced the ledger. The elders argued about precedent and law. A beta called for a show of strength, the old remedy to quell the inconvenient. Somewhere in the uproar, a child began to cry, and the sound was like a bell tolling guilt. Renata watched him with an expression Garrick could not yet parse. Shock, maybe, or relief, or the tiny flame of a hope that burned because someone had finally chosen truth over lineage. She stepped forward, but the elder's hands were faster, catching her wrist before she could cross the dais. The cuffs they used for wilder wolves gleamed like binding promises. "You would side with a woman who attacks your mother?" Ilara asked, wounded in more than bone. "You would allow our enemies to use our weakness?" "She did not attack to destroy," Garrick said. "She attacked because her people were erased." Ilara's voice dropped to something cold enough to freeze a river. "You know nothing of the bargains that sustain a pack. You were never meant to understand the compromises necessary for survival. I made choices so we would not be extinct." "But who pays?" Garrick's roar was quiet, but the room heard it all the same. "Who has been counted as expendable so the thrones across our borders can sleep easier? We have been ledgered, human lives used as columns in contracts, and I cannot live as a ghost who keeps those columns upright." It was one thing to defy an elder, it was another to undo the architecture of a mother's life. Ilara's eyes flashed, and for the first time, Garrick saw not only the alpha, but the woman who once had been less hardened by rule than by necessity. "If you will not stand with me, then you step down, Garrick," she said softly. "You are heir by blood, but not by will. If you choose this, you choose exile. From the line, from the future I carved for you." A throb of old fear moved through him, the terror of being what his mother had always called incomplete, of wandering a territory without a name. But the wolf that had surfaced in the courtyard did not bow to threats so easily. The choice that had felt like an impossibility minutes before crystallized into one cold clarity: to stand with the ledger or to stand with the scorched and the living who pawed for shelter. "I will not be your instrument anymore," Garrick said, the words chiseled by months of small mortifications. "If being alpha means we write away lives as if they're ink, I will not be an heir. I choose the people who suffer." Around him, the council split like ice on a spring river. Some elders picked up their canes and hissed that he had been led astray. Others, particularly the matron whose eyes had grown kinder over the years, whispered that perhaps stagnation had finally met a breaking point. Voices escalated until the hall vibrated with the sound of a world rearranging. Ilara staggered as if struck. For a fleeting moment, less than a breath, she looked like any woman robbed of her plan. Then the alpha armor filled her again, and she met him not as parent, but as sovereign. "Very well," she said. "You renounce your claim?" "I renounce the life you wrote for me," Garrick answered. He was surprised to find that the admission felt like a clean wound, painful at first, but clarifying. "I will not inherit a throne that is bought with others' ashes." The sound that followed was not unanimous condemnation, but something fractal: shouts of betrayal, weeping, the quiet murmurs of packsmen who had always suspected and now had language for their suspicion. Some looked to Ilara with naked faith, and others to Garrick with startling sympathy. The compound he had known since childhood split down the middle as if a seam had been torn. Ilara's next move seared into him like a brand. "Then you make a choice, Garrick Thorne. You are no longer my heir. You are exiled from the line as punishment for this insolence. You will leave the compound at dawn. You will not represent this pack." The elders who upheld her decree thumped on their benches. Some cheered, others scowled. Renata's eyes went dark, but not with triumph, only a deep, bruised sorrow. Garrick had expected sorrow to lap at him as his mother's rejection stung. He had not expected the way his chest would hollow with a loneliness sharp enough to be physical. "You cannot do this," Tomas cried, the goalkeeper of his old loyalties. "He has rights." "Rights," Ilara repeated with a grim, dismissive smile. "Rights are earned, boy." Garrick realized that in an hour he had lost the fragile architecture of his life, the title he had been given at birth, the promise of an orderly future, the illusions that steadied his mother. He also realized something else, and this truth hit him with the force of a river unbound. He was freer in that fracture than he had ever felt inside his gilded cage. Renata's binding was loosed only slightly, as those near her sought to temper the consequences.
She moved to sit, hands still restrained, and when her gaze met Garrick's across the hall, something like a benediction passed between them, a recognition that the world had rearranged, and that between the broken pieces there might be a possibility for something other than what either had been bred to expect. Outside, the courtyard had become a stage for whispered plotting. Splinter groups murmured about alliances, about who would support Alara and who would follow the heir turned outcast.
Mortgages and offices in towns and borders were recalculated. Humans, when word reached the villages, watched and made bets about which side they could trade with. The ledger's exposure had already begun to ripple in ways that would not be contained by a council or a compound. Garrick stood in the middle of it like the center of a sundial, sun and shadow spinning around him. He had shattered the expectation of his life, and in the same breath made a new bed of possibilities, fraught with danger. He had defended truth, only to find the cost blooming like a bruise. That night, when the compound's gates closed and the moon poured its indifferent silver over the walls, Garrick walked alone through corridors that now felt like unfamiliar lungs. He found the courtyard where he had first wolfed, the place where blood had been spilled and declarations made. The place smelled of lavender and iron and a future unmade. Renata, once bound, now loosed for the night under Elder's misgivings, waited there like an offered hand. Her face was streaked with dust and dried blood. She rose as he approached and did not utter a word. "You could have had my title," he said, surprising himself with how hollow the sentence felt. "I could have had power without knowing what it was to watch people burn." "You did not want it," she said simply. "You wanted to stop the burning." Her answer was not a balm, but it was honest. He reached out, not as an heir reaching for a crown, but as a man who had been broken and was learning to be held. Her fingers closed over his with strength, with a touch that said she would not be caged into a role either. Behind them, inside the compound and across the borders, the pack was fracturing. Families chose sides, marriages were reconsidered, guards took uneasy oaths. The elders prepared to call for measures to restore order. Alara retreated to the inner sanctum to marshal allies, those who had always prospered in the old ledger sharpened knives of political maneuvering. And in the hollow that followed, Garrick discovered that some fractures left space for tenderness to seep in. The wolf inside him was no longer a secret, and the man he was becoming was no longer a shadow. He had lost a name and a future handed to him, but as the moon rode high and indifferent, there was Renata's hand in his, and something like a promise, dangerous, forbidden, and achingly real. They stood together in the courtyard where the incense of lavender and the iron of blood still lingered, and the world around them cracked loud enough for everyone to hear. The pack would be remade if it survived at all. The cost was not yet counted, but between them, Garrick and Renata felt a fragile certainty. Some truths required fractures before they could become new shapes. When the first voice rose at dawn to call the guards to form and the elders to speak, Garrick felt the wolf settle under his skin like a companion.
He had stepped off the path his mother had paved, but it felt, for the first time, like a step toward himself. The consequences would be brutal. The love that might grow from this ruin would be forbidden and dangerous. He could not know whether it would heal or kill him. But he knew, with a simple, fierce clarity, that silence would never again be his inheritance. He had broken the ledger. The pieces would cut and sting, but perhaps, through the blood and the truth, something new could be woven, if there was the courage to stitch it. The dawn was brittle, a thin thing the color of old bones, and when the pack assembled, it had the feel of a battlefield at prayer. Men and women clustered into factions like weather fronts, faces taut with fear or fury. Alara stood at the head of the compound as if she had the earth itself at her command. Her voice, when it rose, cut through the morning like a whetstone. She called for order and for the enforcement of the law. She called, too, for the retrieval of what she called stolen honor. That last phrase landed on Garrick like a blow meant to maim him traitor. It did not surprise him that a contingent of mercenaries from a rival Alpha, men who smelled of coin and old grudges, had seized the opportunity to push against the Kestrel borders. What surprised him was how quickly they moved, how readily the pack's uncertainty became an invitation. They came with torches and an oath to reclaim what they called abandoned land. They came with orders whispered in taverns and promises of gold. They did not know, as Garrick did now, that borders were not drawed Ryans on a map, but lives kept from cold. The first clash was a blur of metal and shouts. The moon that had watched the council the night before still hung pale and merciless, and at its peak the wolves stung into their halos of light, claws digging into earth and bone. The mercenaries thought they were facing a divided pack. They were mistaken.
Fear and anger, braided in equal measure, made desperate warriors of men who had been steady for years. Garrick found himself at the forefront not because he had command, but because something older than titles answered the cry of those who needed shelter. Renata fought at his side, wild and precise, her dagger a lesson in economy, small movements that killed the wind of a soldier's breath. She moved with a speed betraying years of hunger and practice. Every strike she made seemed not only to wound an enemy, but to make a ledger tick toward justice. Ilara's soldiers ranged like a line drawn by a cartographer who understood implacable geometry. For a moment, Garrick feared the compound would split open with the violence of its own making, old lines and new truths slashing asunder. He could hear the cry of the old guard, the echoing order, protect the Alpha, enforce the law. He could also hear Renata's voice near his ear, low and focusing. Watch the left flank. Don't let them circle toward the children.
He obeyed because he could not stand to watch small lives become collateral to politics. He also obeyed because he had no map for what he could be otherwise. Action gave him clarity. He moved with a ferocity that surprised him. The wolf inside him allowed motion without apology. He felt the blood on his knuckles and the grit in his teeth and the dizzying, suffocating exhilaration of being alive to hurt and heal. The turning point came when a mercenary archer, perched like a blackbird on a parapet, let loose a fan of arrows that arced toward the compound's nursery. A child screamed as infants were bundled into arms and shields raised like a desperate wall. Garrick saw the shaft fly slow enough that he swore he could see the way the light bent on the feather. The wolf made the decision before his mind could stall. He sprinted, lungs burning, limbs loosened by the animal inside him. The world reduced to vectors, the arrow, the child, the distance, and Garrick threw himself forward with the reckless mercy of those born to protect. He met the arrow with his shoulder. Pain tore through him, bright and volcanic, the shaft lodged deep and bitter. He ate the world's pain and kept moving, dragging a small bundle of a child behind some stacked crates as Renata threw herself across his back like a second skin, cutting down the soldier who sought to finish them. Blood spilled over his ribs in a hot line, and the pain was a map that led him to a clarity he had not expected. In the scramble that followed, Renata stayed, blades singing, and when Garrick's legs faltered, she put her hands on his shoulders and steadied him with a feral tenderness that made the pack roar around them like surf. For a precarious heartbeat, she looked into his face, into the wolf's eyes, and then into the man beneath, and there was no calculation in her expression, only something like a vow. "Hold on," she said simply. "You will live to choose." Her words were both prophecy and command. He tasted copper and the salt of her breath, and with a ragged laugh, half a sob, half triumph, he thought of the ledger he had refused to prop up. He thought of the villagers who had cried out and not been heard. He thought of his mother's ledgered safety. He felt the wolf's heart steady, larger than the wound, and he felt the man's resolve knit into something durable. The battle took its toll. Shouts dwindled into panting and then into a lament of moans as the invaders realized the cost of their miscalculation. Garrick's body ached and stung and sang with a pain that made the air around him narrow and bright. The mercenaries were driven off as the pack, splintered and furious and newly united by a common enemy, rallied in a way that surprised even the elders. Men who had argued at council hours earlier now fought shoulder to shoulder. When the smoke cleared and the dawn again found the compound gasping for breath, Ilara moved through the aftermath like a sovereign assessing loss.
Her eyes fell on Garrick as he knelt on the ground, the arrow still embedded but his hands steady on the child he had saved. For a moment the Alpha's face was unreadable. The throne she sat upon had been threatened in ways that bled into the marrow of who she thought she was. Then, slowly, her knees bent. She came to him without ceremony, and the guards who would have pulled her back did not. She knelt and placed a hand upon the arrow and then upon his shoulder, and for a second, Garrick thought the world had folded into a private room. Pain laughed low in his chest, and the wolf hummed like a struck chord. He expected accusation. Instead, he felt his mother's fingers curl with an urgency he had only ever seen before in matters of war. "You," she began, voice raw. "You idiot." There it was, love in the form of insult. It made tears spring in his eyes. He wanted to tell her he had chosen truth and people over title, to explain that his wound had been worth the child's safety. But the words stuck like flecks of broken glass. Instead, Renata leaned in, her thumb pressed over the arrowed wound to staunch the leak of red.
Their hands touched, and for the briefest sliver of time there was nothing present among them but the heat of two bodies that had bled for others. Ilara's breath hitched. She looked not at Renata with hate, but at the way her son was cradled by a woman he had been taught to despise. The Alpha's composure cracked, and the fragments that fell from it were small, human things: regret, fear, and a dawning recognition that the ledger had been built on the backs of people she could no longer ignore. "You gave yourself," she said at last, the words breaking in jagged pieces. "You gave yourself for a child." Garrick's laugh was wet and small. "People deserve protection," he said, "not because of borders, but because they are people." Ilara stared at him as if she saw him for the first time, not as an heir in waiting, but as a man with a wolf and a very particular form of courage. The Alpha's face shifted through expressions too fast to name: pride, terror, the grim acceptance of an elder who was both mother and sovereign. Then, as in surrender, she began to move, barking orders that no one could misread. Healers to his side, warmth to Renata's hands, aids to retrieve what remained of the invaders' stores. As the healers worked, Renata's hand found his again, fingers rapping with intimate force. Derek's vision tunneled. He could feel the wound, but he could also feel the pulse of her heartbeat under calloused palm. "You should be furious," she whispered into his ear, a private confession. "You should hate me." He smiled around the ache. It felt like confession. "I'm angry," he admitted, "at what was done, at what we let happen. But I'm not sorry I didn't let you go." She leaned forward and kissed the curve of his mouth, quick and sure, and the action was less a theft than a sealing.
It tasted of salt and iron, and the blood that both of them had given for the living. Around them the compound reeled and reformed. Alliances shifted like weather. The elders would meet, the ledger would be read into new light, and consequences would be counted in days and in life sentences. Garrick knew the price he would pay would be steep. Exile still whispered from the mouths of those in power. His mother's forgiveness, if it came at all, would be hard won. But when he opened his eyes and saw Renata's face lit by the feverish glow of the healer's lamp, when he felt the warmth of her hand like an anchor, he realized something that filled him with a courage not unrelated to the wolf's. The sacrifice he had offered, the wound, the renunciation, the stepping off the map of an heir, had not been meaningless. He had chosen people. He had chosen a truth. He had chosen a woman who had set him free by breaking him open. Ilara watched them. The weight of command and the ache of a mother warred inside her like rival tides. She touched Garrick's brow as if to check for fever, and then, quietly, leaned close enough to murmur, "You bloody fool." He squeezed his eyes shut at the sound, less rebuke now than fragile admission. He could not tell if it meant reconciliation. Perhaps it was only the beginning of a road neither of them had wanted to walk. But in the hollow of that compound, among the tang of lavender and the metallic memory of blood, the smell of change was sharp and real. Renata's voice dropped to a fierce whisper that only he could hear. "If they brand you for this, we will carry it together." Garrick opened his eyes and saw in her face the map of a future built from ruins, dangerous, uneven, but no longer penned by someone else's hand. The wound in his side throbbed. The wolf stirred at the edge of sleep. He smiled, a crooked thing, and with the last of his breath's stubborn pride said, "Then let us begin to carry it." They would lose territory and titles, perhaps family members, certainly the comforts of an expected life. They might bleed and cry and watch friends choose other allegiances. But beneath the bruise of the present, something tender took root, an alliance forged under steel and moonlight, sealed by a sacrifice that had been both violent and redemptive. In the center of that battered courtyard, with the world rearranging itself faster than any of them could name, Garrick and Renata held hands and accepted the cost. They would learn together how to stitch a pack that protected all its people. They would learn painfully and beautifully what it meant to be free not from law, but from ledgered cruelty. And when the healers finally eased the arrow from his side and the blood stilled into a slow, steady rhythm, Garrick understood that sacrifice had not been the end, but the opening, an impossible, dangerous, and incandescent beginning. Dawn uncoiled slow and merciless, and with it, the long, small labor of repair began.
The compound that had been a single, immovable thing now moved in fits and starts, healers binding wounds, elders huddling in fretful constellations, children being counted like prayers. Garrick watched from the low bench where the healers had let him sit, Renata's hand threaded through his, both of them raw and ridiculous under the same daylight. The arrow scar on his side would mark him like a vow. The bruise where his mother had gripped him would remind him of what had been lost and what had been learned. Elara rose that morning as both alpha and mother, and while she did not unmake every hard thing she had done, she unlatched something she had kept bolted for decades, the willingness to be seen as flawed. The ledger would not be burned in a single motion, centuries of treaties and habits.